In the ancient city of Babylon, roughly 4,000 years ago, the air was thick with ambition and the sound of countless languages, all unified in one impossible goal: to build a structure so magnificent, so technologically advanced, that it would make them equal to God Himself. This is more than just the story of a tower. It was humanity's first global civilization, their most brilliant minds, and the moment they decided that divine authority was optional. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the Tower of Babel represents the most pivotal moment in human history, and why some scholars believe we're living through Babel 2.0 right now. So, before we get into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I'd love to hear from you. Please introduce yourself, let us know where you're watching from, and what time it is. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? The One World Blueprint. Unity before the fall. The Great Flood had swept away everything humanity once built. Now the descendants of Noah spread across the earth, and something remarkable existed among them. One voice, one tongue, one way of understanding each other completely. Genesis chapter 11 opens with this stunning reality. The whole earth spoke the same language. Every person could share their thoughts with perfect clarity. No barriers existed between minds. When someone spoke, everyone understood. This wasn't the peaceful paradise we might imagine. This unity created something far more dangerous: collective power without limits. The people journeyed eastward. They found a plain in the land of Shinar, that ancient region between two great rivers. The soil was rich. The land stretched endlessly. They looked at this place and made a choice that would echo through all of human history. They decided to stop wandering. They would settle here together. But settling wasn't enough. The unity they possessed sparked a greater ambition. They had learned to work as one people. They spoke with one voice. They shared one vision. This combination created the perfect conditions for humanity's most audacious project. Not survival, not simply building homes or planting crops. Something far grander was taking shape in their collective imagination. The post-flood world carried a divine command. God had told Noah and his sons to fill the earth, to spread out and multiply across the lands. Yet here in Shinar, humanity paused. They gathered instead of scattering. They consolidated instead of dispersing. The command to spread was clear, but they chose concentration. The instruction was to fill the earth, but they opted for a single location. This wasn't accidental. The decision to remain in one place, speaking one language, working toward one goal, set the stage for something unprecedented. Their shared tongue meant shared dreams. Their common understanding meant unified action. No miscommunication could stop them. No language barrier could slow their progress. Whatever they conceived, they could achieve together. The text reveals something crucial about this moment. The unity existed, but it lacked divine purpose. These people possessed incredible potential. They had the intelligence, the cooperation, the communication to build anything they could imagine. But the direction of that power would determine everything. Would they use this unity to honor their creator, or would they turn it toward themselves? Ancient Mesopotamia, that cradle of civilization between the rivers, provided the perfect setting. The land offered resources in abundance: clay for bricks, reeds for baskets, water for crops. The rivers brought life and trade. The flat plains allowed for massive construction projects. Geography and human ambition were about to collide in spectacular fashion. The people weren't primitive or simple. They possessed knowledge passed down from before the flood. They understood agriculture, animal husbandry, basic engineering. Their minds were sharp. Their bodies were strong. The generations immediately following the flood lived longer lives than we do today, which meant accumulated wisdom and experience guided their choices. This unity of language created something we can barely comprehend today. Imagine a world where every person you meet speaks your tongue perfectly. Every stranger shares your words. Every traveler can communicate without effort. The psychological effect alone would be staggering. No foreigners existed, no outsiders. Everyone was part of the same linguistic family, the same cultural sphere. But this sameness created vulnerability. When everyone thinks alike, dangerous ideas spread without resistance. When everyone speaks the same language, there's no outside perspective to challenge the consensus. Unity became uniformity. Cooperation became conformity. The strength of their shared voice would soon become the source of their greatest rebellion. The stage was set. One people, one language, one place, one emerging plan that would challenge heaven itself. They stood on the plains of Shinar, looked at the resources around them, felt the power of their unified voice, and decided to do something that would force God himself to come down and see what they had built. This wasn't humanity at its worst yet. This was humanity at its most capable, its most organized, its most unified. And that precisely was the problem. The greater the unity without divine direction, the greater the potential for collective catastrophe. The blueprint was drawn. The One World project was about to begin, and nothing in their shared language suggested anyone would stop them. The Brick Revolution, the technology of ambition. They discovered something that changed everything, not a philosophy or a religious idea, but a technology so simple and so powerful that it made the impossible seem within reach. They learned to make bricks. Before this moment, building meant working with stone. Stone was hard, irregular, limited by what nature provided. You could only build what the rocks allowed. You had to find the right stones, transport them, fit them together imperfectly. Stone was the material of limits, of working within boundaries set by creation itself. But bricks were different. Bricks meant humans could manufacture their own building materials. They could shape the earth itself into uniform blocks, fire them in kilns, and stack them as high as they dared. The text captures this breakthrough with striking simplicity. Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. This wasn't just a construction technique. This was humanity seizing control of the raw materials of creation. Clay was everywhere in Shinar. The rivers deposited it with every flood season. Mold it, dry it in the sun, and you had crude building blocks. But they went further. They burned the bricks thoroughly, hardening them with fire until they became as strong as stone. Then they discovered something else, bitumen, that natural tar that seeped from the ground in this region. It made the perfect mortar, binding bricks together with waterproof strength. The psychological shift cannot be overstated. When humans could manufacture their own materials, they stopped thinking like creatures working within creation and started thinking like gods shaping it. The brick wasn't just a building block, it represented autonomy, independence, the power to create rather than merely use what was given. Watch how the technology changed their language. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks. Then, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower." The phrase repeats, "Come, let us." This was collective action, but notice the subject. Not let us build for God or let us create in service to, just let us build ourselves. The technology of the brick gave birth to the theology of self. The ziggurat form was already known in ancient Mesopotamia. These massive stepped pyramids rose from the flat plains like artificial mountains. Temple complexes crowned their peaks. Priests climbed the long staircases to perform rituals at the summit. But the builders at Babel had something different in mind. Their tower would have its top in the heavens, not merely tall, but symbolically reaching upward to the realm of the divine itself. Baked brick made this ambition feasible. Stone structures required enormous effort and skilled craftsmen, but bricks could be mass-produced. Every person could contribute. Children could mold clay, adults could fire kilns, teams could lay courses with speed and precision. The technology democratized construction, and that democratization fed the collective ambition. The bitumen mortar added another layer of meaning. This wasn't the lime mortar used in other regions. Bitumen came from the earth itself, that black substance that bubbled up from the depths. In later times, this same material would be used to waterproof Noah's Ark. But here it served to bind human ambition into a solid mass, each brick locked to the next in a structure that could theoretically rise forever. Consider the engineering marvel they were attempting. A ziggurat large enough to be seen for miles, strong enough to last for generations, tall enough to pierce the clouds. The mathematics alone required sophisticated understanding. The logistics demanded organization on a massive scale. Thousands of workers, millions of bricks, years, perhaps decades of sustained effort. But they had the numbers. They had the unity. They had the shared language to coordinate complex tasks. And now they had the technology that made their dream tangible. Every brick represented a small victory over natural limits. Every course laid was proof that humans could build their own ladder to heaven. The symbolism runs deeper still. Bricks are uniform, identical, interchangeable. Unlike natural stone with its unique character, each brick looks like every other brick. This reflected their one language unity. Individuality mattered less than conformity to the shared vision. Each person was a brick in the larger structure, valued for their contribution to the collective work rather than their unique qualities. The kilns burned day and night. The brick production never stopped. The construction crews worked in shifts. The project consumed the entire community. This wasn't a temple for worship or a palace for a king. This was humanity's statement of intent. We can build. We can reach. We can ascend. We need no one's permission or help. The technology of the brick made them believe they had transcended their creaturely status. They had moved from using creation to manufacturing their own materials, from finding their place in the world to reshaping the world to their specifications, from accepting limits to demolishing them, one fired brick at a time. The tower rose on the plains, brick by brick, course by course. The structure grew taller, casting longer shadows, becoming more impressive with each passing season. The people looked at their work and saw proof that nothing was beyond their reach. The brick revolution had not merely given them a new building material, it had given them a new identity, builders of their own destiny, architects of their own ascension. The Declaration of Independence. Let us make a name. Now we reach the heart of the matter, the true motive behind the bricks and the tower, the actual rebellion that was taking place. They spoke their intention plainly. Let us make a name for ourselves. 4 words in English, even fewer in Hebrew. But within them lies one of the most profound acts of defiance in all of human history. This wasn't about architecture or urban planning. This was about identity, glory, and who gets to determine human worth. In the ancient Near East, a name carried weight far beyond our modern understanding. A name wasn't just a label or a convenient identifier. A name represented essence, character, reputation, and legacy. To have a name meant you existed in the collective memory of humanity. To make a name meant establishing your own significance, declaring your own worth, determining your own destiny. Consider what happened earlier in Genesis. God gave Adam the task of naming the animals. This act represented authority and relationship. God renamed Abram to Abraham, marking a covenant and a new identity. Names came from above, from the one with authority, from the source of being itself. But here at Babel, humanity decided they would name themselves. The phrase reveals its full audacity when we examine what it replaces. The people didn't say, "Let us honor God's name," or "Let us make our city great in service to the divine." They claimed for themselves what belonged to God alone, the right to establish their own significance apart from Him. This was autonomy in its purest form. They wanted fame, not just survival or prosperity, but recognition that would outlast their lifetimes. The tower and city would stand as monuments declaring, "We were here, we built this, remember us." This drive for immortality through achievement runs deep in human nature. We want to matter, we want to be remembered. We want our existence to count for something beyond our brief years. But they sought this significance through their own effort, by their own strength, for their own glory. The name they wanted to make was self-generated, self-sustained, self-glorifying. No dependence on divine blessing. No acknowledgement of being created in God's image, just raw human will, united effort, and the determination to be great on their own terms. The text adds a crucial detail about their motive, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. This reveals fear beneath the ambition. They had heard God's command to fill the earth. They knew they were supposed to spread out, to scatter, to populate distant lands. But scattering meant weakness. Dispersion meant losing the power of unity. Spreading out would end their one voice, one language advantage. So the tower and city served a dual purpose. They would make a great name, and they would anchor themselves in one location, resisting God's command to fill the earth. The construction project was both monument and anchor, both statement of glory and act of defiance, both reaching upward to heaven and digging in against divine instruction. Consider the irony that follows in the biblical narrative. After Babel, God calls Abram out of this same region. To this one man, God makes a promise. I will make your name great. Not go make a name for yourself, but I will make your name great. The same word, but the source reversed. Humans striving for self-made fame versus divine blessing that establishes true significance. The Abrahamic covenant stands as the direct answer to Babel's rebellion. Where Babel sought glory through human achievement, Abraham received glory through divine promise. Where Babel tried to make their name last through impressive construction, Abraham's name endures through spiritual descendants more numerous than stars. Where Babel resisted scattering, Abraham left his homeland in obedience. The builders at Babel wanted something that wasn't wrong in itself. Humans should want to matter. We should want our lives to have meaning. We should want to build and create and leave something valuable behind. These desires reflect being made in God's image, bearing His creative nature. The problem wasn't the desire, but the direction. They turned these good impulses toward themselves rather than toward their Creator. The tower reaching to heaven symbolized their attempt to access divine status without divine appointment. They wanted to ascend on their own, to achieve greatness through their own power, to sit among the clouds as equals with God. The vertical architecture matched their spiritual ambition, upward mobility by human effort. Think about the collective psychology at work. When a whole society agrees on a goal, especially an ambitious one, doubt becomes nearly impossible. The shared language meant shared narratives. Everyone repeated the same stories about their project. Everyone reinforced everyone else's belief in their great undertaking. No dissenting voices could be heard above the unified chorus singing of human capability. This is what makes self-made glory so seductive. It depends on no one. It requires no humility. It demands no acknowledgement of dependence or creatureliness. You look at what your hands have built and say, I did this. The tower stood as physical proof of human achievement. Every course of bricks was evidence of their capability. Every meter of height was validation of their vision. Let us make a name for ourselves. The first recorded declaration of human autonomy, the original manifesto of self-determination, the foundational statement of glory apart from God. 4 words that captured the essence of human rebellion, the desire to establish our own worth, to secure our own legacy, to ensure we are remembered, all on our own terms and by our own strength. The bricks were just materials. The tower was just architecture. But the name they sought to make was the heart of everything, and that name was about to be forever associated not with glory but with confusion. The divine descent, God's intervention as mercy, not petty wrath. Then the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. That simple phrase carries profound theological weight. The God who sees all, who knows every thought before it's formed, came down. Not because he lacked knowledge, but because this moment required a response that the narrative presents as deliberate, considered, and ultimately merciful. We often miss the tenderness in God's intervention. The popular imagination paints this as an angry deity crushing human ambition out of petty jealousy. Look at what the text actually shows. God doesn't destroy the tower. He doesn't send fire or flood. He doesn't punish with plague or death. He does something far more subtle and far more kind. He limits their capacity for unified evil. God observed what they had begun and spoke a troubling truth. Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language. This is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Notice the concern, not about the tower itself, but about what comes after. This was only the beginning. If left unchecked, what would humanity attempt next? The unity that seemed so powerful, so beneficial, revealed its dark side. Yes, unified humans could build amazing structures. They could accomplish incredible feats of engineering and organization, but that same unity could be turned toward tremendous evil. One language meant one propaganda could spread unchecked. One people meant no outside perspective could challenge dangerous ideas. One shared culture meant no refuge for dissenters. Think of what history has shown about humanity's capacity for collective evil. The worst atrocities have often emerged from highly organized, unified societies. When everyone speaks the same language and shares the same vision, mob mentality can sweep populations into unspeakable acts. The very unity that enabled the tower could enable far worse horrors. God's solution was elegant. He confused their language. Suddenly, the bricklayer couldn't understand the mortar mixer. The engineer couldn't communicate with the labor crews. The project managers couldn't coordinate between teams. Not through destruction, but through the simple introduction of diversity, the whole enterprise ground to a halt. This wasn't punishment. This was protection. God limited humanity's power to act in complete unity. He forced diversity. He created barriers that would slow the spread of both good ideas and evil ones. He made instant, massive cooperation more difficult, and in doing so, he protected humanity from itself. Consider the mercy in this act. God could have wiped them out as he did the generation before the flood. He could have started over again with a righteous remnant. He could have sent immediate judgment. Instead, he simply made it harder for them to unite in rebellion. He dispersed them, yes, but he dispersed them into different language groups that would develop unique cultures, perspectives, and approaches to life. The text connects this back to earlier rebellions. In the garden, humans grasped for knowledge that wasn't yet theirs. Before the flood, humanity's wickedness had become continuous, every thought evil. Now at Babel, united humanity was on the verge of attempting anything they could imagine. The pattern was clear. Human hearts, especially in unity, trend toward rebellion. God's intervention broke that pattern. The confusion of languages forced humility. Suddenly, humans needed help to communicate. They needed translation, mediation, patience in understanding others. The barriers created by different languages made humans more dependent on each other and, ideally, more aware of their dependence on God. The scattering that followed was an exile to punishment camps. God dispersed them across the earth, which was his original command anyway. He spread humanity over the face of the whole earth, forcing them to fill it as he had instructed from the beginning. What they tried to resist through the tower, God accomplished through linguistic confusion. Some ask why God would oppose human achievement, but that's not what happened. God opposed unified rebellion, not achievement itself. He opposed the self-glorifying unity that would inevitably lead to greater evil. The problem wasn't that they were building something impressive. The problem was the heart behind it and the trajectory it set for the future. The divine descent reveals something crucial about God's character. He engages with human history. He doesn't stand aloof, watching from a distance. When humanity moves in a direction that will lead to destruction, he intervenes. When our ambitions threaten to lead us into greater darkness, he adjusts the playing field. Think about what wasn't confused. God didn't take away human creativity or intelligence or the ability to build. He didn't reduce humanity to primitive helplessness. He simply made the most dangerous form of unity impossible to maintain. Humans could still accomplish great things, but now they would have to do so with the awareness that others existed who saw the world. The tower stood unfinished, not demolished, but abandoned. The people scattered, not as refugees fleeing catastrophe, but as groups moving away from each other, as language barriers made cooperation impossible. They left their monument incomplete, a permanent reminder that human glory pursued apart from God will always remain unfinished. This divine intervention set the stage for the rest of human history. The nations that formed from this scattering would develop unique languages, cultures, traditions, and perspectives. Diversity became hardwired into human experience. The ease of unified action was replaced with the difficulty of cross-cultural communication and cooperation. But within that difficulty lay protection. No single empire could easily swallow all others. No single language could dominate completely. No single culture could impose its vision on all humanity without resistance. The confusion of languages created checks and balances in human civilization that still operate today. God came down not in wrath, but in wisdom. He saw the trajectory. He understood what unlimited human unity would produce. And he loved humanity enough to limit our capacity for collective catastrophe, even if it meant making our ambitions harder to achieve. The confusion was mercy. The scattering was grace, and the unfinished tower stood as witness to the day God protected humanity from itself. The archaeology of ambition, hunting for the historical Babel. Now we step from biblical text into the dust and ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. The story of Babel lives in Scripture, but did it also leave its mark in clay and stone? The search for historical Babel has obsessed archaeologists for over a century. The land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, shows evidence of sophisticated civilization going back thousands of years. Cities rose from the alluvial plains. Complex societies developed writing, law codes, astronomical knowledge, and impressive architecture. And scattered throughout this region stand the remains of ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids that dominated the ancient skyline. Babylon itself, located in what is now Iraq, became one of the most powerful cities of the ancient world. The name itself connects to Babel. In Hebrew, Babel means confusion, but in Akkadian, Babili means gate of the god. The linguistic link is clear even if the meanings diverge dramatically. Archaeologists excavating Babylon discovered the foundations of an enormous ziggurat called Etemenanki, which means temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. The structure was dedicated to Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon. According to ancient descriptions, this ziggurat rose in 7 stages to a height of roughly 90 meters, an imposing presence visible for miles across the flat plains. The Esagila tablet, a Babylonian cuneiform document, provides dimensions and descriptions of Etemenanki. The base measured approximately 90 meters on each side. The structure used millions of baked bricks. Bitumen mortar bound them together, just as the biblical text describes. The match between the Genesis account and the archaeological evidence is striking. But was Etemenanki the Tower of Babel? The timeline presents challenges. The ziggurat that archaeologists have studied was built and rebuilt over centuries. The structure standing during the Babylonian Empire was likely not the original. Earlier versions might have stood on the same site, going back to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Other ziggurats dot the Mesopotamian landscape. At Ur, the ziggurat of Nana still stands partially intact, its mud brick core and fired brick exterior showing the same construction techniques mentioned in Genesis. At Uruk, at Eridu, at Nippur, similar structures rose from the plains, each one a testament to human ambition and religious devotion. The archaeological evidence shows that ziggurat construction was a sustained practice across many centuries and different city-states. These weren't simple temples, they were statements of power, wealth, and divine connection. The higher the ziggurat, the more impressive the city, the closer its people could claim to be to the heavens. Ancient cuneiform texts reveal the mindset behind ziggurat construction. Kings boasted about building projects. Inscriptions declare how many bricks were manufactured, how many workers labored, how high the structure reached. The texts drip with pride in human achievement, the same pride that Genesis attributes to the builders of Babel. Some scholars suggest the biblical Babel story isn't about one specific tower, but represents a theological commentary on the entire Mesopotamian ziggurat tradition. The Genesis account takes this whole cultural practice, this architectural embodiment of reaching toward the divine, and provides a different narrative. What Babylonians saw as gates to the gods, the biblical authors presented as monuments to human hubris. The construction techniques match perfectly. Archaeological digs have uncovered ancient brick-making facilities. The process was exactly as Genesis describes: clay molded into uniform shapes, dried, then fired in kilns to create durable building blocks. Bitumen, that natural petroleum seepage common in the region, served as waterproof mortar. The biblical account demonstrates accurate knowledge of Mesopotamian building practices. But historical accuracy in details doesn't necessarily mean the Genesis story records a specific historical event at a specific time. The text might be preserving cultural memory of the rise of these great cities and their towers. It might be offering a theological interpretation of what those structures represented spiritually, even if the details about linguistic confusion and divine intervention aren't meant to be read as historical reportage. The connection between Babylon and Babel becomes especially significant during the Babylonian exile. When the kingdom of Judah fell and its people were carried away to Babylon in the 6th century before the Common Era, they encountered the rebuilt Etemenanki in all its glory. Here stood the embodiment of imperial power, a structure that seemed to touch the sky, in a city that claimed to be the gate of the gods. For the exiled Jews, the Babel story would have provided a powerful counter-narrative. Yes, Babylon looked impressive. Yes, the ziggurat dominated the skyline. Yes, the empire seemed invincible. But remember Babel. Remember what happened when humanity tried to build its way to heaven. Remember how God responds to such pride. The Genesis story became a form of resistance literature, a way of maintaining faith when surrounded by the monuments of a conquering power. Archaeological evidence can't prove or disprove the Babel account as written. We find ziggurats. We discover that the construction techniques match. We verify that Babylon was a great city with impressive architecture. But whether God actually confused languages at a specific moment, whether a specific tower building project prompted divine intervention, these questions lie outside what archaeology can definitively answer. What the ruins do show is that the biblical authors knew Mesopotamian culture intimately. They understood how ziggurats were built, what they represented, how cities organized massive construction projects. The Genesis account doesn't read like fantasy or pure myth. It reads like a theological interpretation of real places, real structures, and real human ambitions. The search for historical Babel continues. Each excavation adds details to our understanding of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. Each cuneiform tablet reveals more about how these ancient peoples understood their relationship to the divine. And standing among the ruins of great ziggurats, even today one can imagine the ambition that drove humans to pile brick upon brick, reaching upward, declaring through architecture that humans could build their own way to the heavens. The Sumerian parallel, the Eridu Genesis, and other tower tales. The Babel story doesn't stand alone in ancient literature. Other cultures from the same region told remarkably similar tales of human ambition, divine displeasure, and the origin of linguistic diversity. These parallel narratives reveal how the biblical account fits into a broader conversation happening across the ancient Near East. The Sumerian civilization, which predated Babylonian power in Mesopotamia, produced texts that echo themes from the Babel narrative. One particularly fascinating parallel appears in a story called Enmerkar and the Lord of Arada, dating back to around the 21st century before the Common Era. In this Sumerian epic, a time is described when humanity spoke one language. The god Enki, associated with wisdom and mischief, confounds human speech in response to a dispute between two rival cities. The text explicitly states that once the whole universe spoke one language, but then Enki changed the speech in human mouths, bringing contention into it. The similarity to Genesis is impossible to ignore. Another Sumerian text, often called the Eridu Genesis, contains fragments describing early human civilization, a great flood, and the confusion of languages. Though the tablets are damaged and much of the text is lost, enough remains to show that Sumerian tradition included a story about linguistic diversity arising from divine action. These parallels raise important questions. Did the biblical authors borrow from earlier Sumerian sources? Did both traditions draw from an even older, shared cultural memory? Or did similar human experiences, similar observations about linguistic diversity and the ruins of great towers, naturally produce similar stories? The ancient Near East was deeply interconnected. Trade routes crossed Mesopotamia. Armies conquered and were conquered. Empires rose and fell. Cultural exchange was constant and profound. Ideas, stories, and religious concepts flowed between civilizations. The Israelites weren't isolated. They lived amid these cultures, often under their rule. What distinguishes the biblical Babel account from its Mesopotamian parallels? The theology. In Sumerian texts, the confusion of language often serves a divine whim or results from petty conflicts between gods. In Genesis, it flows from a coherent understanding of God's character and human nature. The confusion serves a purpose, limiting humanity's capacity for unified evil while accomplishing the divine command to fill the earth. Other ancient cultures preserved their own explanations for linguistic diversity. Egyptian texts mention different languages as simply facts of creation. Greek mythology offered various stories about the origin of different peoples and their tongues. But none matched the theological sophistication and narrative power of the Genesis account. The biblical authors took a common ancient question, why do humans speak different languages? And provided an answer rooted in their understanding of God and human rebellion. They likely knew the Sumerian versions. They may have intentionally crafted their narrative as a response or correction to those earlier stories. Consider what this means for understanding Scripture. The Bible doesn't exist in a vacuum. The authors engaged with the ideas and stories of their time. They borrowed literary forms, acknowledged common cultural knowledge, and sometimes directly challenged prevailing narratives. This doesn't diminish biblical authority. It shows how God worked through real people in real historical contexts. The ziggurat tradition itself provides another layer of parallel. Every major Mesopotamian city boasted a ziggurat dedicated to its patron deity. These structures served similar functions across different city-states. The architectural form was standardized, a series of stepped platforms culminating in a temple at the summit. Priests would ascend the long staircases to perform rituals meant to bridge earth and heaven. Ancient inscriptions reveal the mindset behind ziggurat construction. Kings wanted to be remembered as the builders of great temples. They competed with their predecessors and rival cities to construct taller, more impressive structures. The rhetoric surrounding these building projects drips with pride and ambition, the same attitudes Genesis attributes to the Babel builders. The Epic of Gilgamesh, another Mesopotamian masterpiece, includes descriptions of great walls and buildings that reach toward the heavens. The ancient literature of this region repeatedly returns to themes of human achievement in construction, the building of great cities, and attempts to secure immortal fame through impressive architecture. These parallels suggest the Genesis Babel story addresses real historical practices and attitudes widespread in ancient Mesopotamia. The biblical authors weren't inventing concerns about human pride in building projects. They were commenting on actual cultural phenomena they witnessed or knew from tradition. The concept of divine beings coming down to observe and intervene in human affairs also appears throughout ancient Near Eastern literature. Gods descending from heavenly realms to interact with earth was a common motif. What makes the Genesis version distinct is the nature of the divine response. Not capricious anger, but measured limitation motivated by concern for humanity's future. Language itself held profound significance in ancient thought. To speak was to have power. To name something was to have authority over it. To share a language was to share identity. The confusion of languages, therefore, represented a fundamental reordering of human society and power structures. This theme resonates across multiple ancient cultures precisely because it touched something universal in human experience. The existence of parallel stories doesn't invalidate the biblical account. If anything, it validates the questions the Genesis narrative addresses. Humans across cultures wondered about linguistic diversity. They observed ruins of great towers. They told stories trying to explain these phenomena. The biblical version stands out for its theological depth and its unflinching critique of human pride. These Sumerian and Mesopotamian parallels also reveal something else. The Babel story was part of an ongoing cultural conversation. The biblical authors contributed to debates and discussions that had been happening for centuries. They offered their unique theological perspective on questions that everyone in the ancient world was asking. Understanding these parallels helps us read Genesis more carefully. The authors knew they weren't the first to tell a tower story. They crafted their account deliberately, choosing their words precisely, shaping the narrative to convey specific truths about God, humanity, and the consequences of pride. The parallels don't diminish this achievement, they highlight it. Babel in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's legacy and the Jewish exile. Picture this. You're dragged hundreds of miles from the only home you've ever known. Your city lies in ruins behind you. The temple where your God dwelt is nothing but ash and rubble. You walk in chains alongside thousands of your people, many weeping, some silent with shock. The journey takes weeks, maybe months. Your feet bleed. Your throat burns with thirst. Children cry for parents who didn't survive the siege. Then you arrive. Before you rises something you cannot comprehend. A city so vast it makes your destroyed homeland look like a village. Walls so thick that chariots race along their tops. Gates covered in glazed blue tiles that shimmer like the sky itself. And there, at the heart of everything, towering above palaces and temples, stands a mountain made by human hands. 7 levels climbing toward heaven. The Etemenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth. This was the experience of the Jewish exiles when they first saw Babylon around 597 BCE. The city had been restored to glory by King Nebuchadnezzar II, the same ruler who had besieged Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and brought them here in chains. The supreme cruelty wasn't just captivity. It was being forced to witness what human ambition built when it served empire rather than covenant. Nebuchadnezzar had grand designs. He expanded his capital into the largest city on earth, covering more than 10 square kilometers. His inscriptions boast of his work on countless temples. Beyond just architecture, he rebuilt the Ebenanki ziggurat, a project his father Nabopolassar had started but left unfinished. The structure had been damaged centuries earlier. Nebuchadnezzar saw potential in its restoration. He poured resources and labor into making it magnificent once more. The tower stood at the center of Babylonian religious life. 7 stages rose from the earth, each painted a different color: white, black, purple, blue, vermilion, silver, gold. At the summit sat a temple to Marduk, Babylon's chief god. The whole structure measured roughly 90 meters square at its base and rose to similar heights. Imagine standing at its foot, craning your neck upward, seeing level after level climbing into the morning haze. The exiles couldn't ignore it. They saw it every day. It dominated the skyline. More than that, it dominated their theological crisis. They'd been taught that their God was supreme, that he'd chosen them, that his covenant was eternal. Yet here they were, prisoners in a land where another god seemed to reign supreme. Marduk's tower stood complete. Yahweh's temple lay in ruins. This tension produced something unexpected. Rather than losing faith, many Jewish scholars and priests began to write. They gathered oral traditions, ancient stories, genealogies. They shaped these into texts that would become parts of what we now call the Hebrew Bible. The exile became a time of intense literary and theological activity. The story of Babel likely took its final form during this period. Scholars believe the Genesis account was compiled and edited by priestly writers during or shortly after the Babylonian captivity. They weren't creating the story from nothing. The tradition was old, passed down through generations. Yet now it took on sharper meaning. It became a powerful counter-narrative to everything Babylon represented. Consider the theological move happening here. The exiles looked at the Etemenanki and said, in effect, this tower represents the same impulse that led to the original Babel. It's humanity declaring independence from God. It's pride dressed up as religious devotion. It's the worship of human achievement rather than the Creator. By framing their captor's greatest monument as a symbol of divine judgment, they maintained their identity and hope. The Genesis text makes this critique subtle, but devastating. The builders at Babel say they'll make a name for themselves. They'll build a city and tower reaching heaven. They'll avoid being scattered. Every one of these goals mirrors Babylonian imperial ideology. Nebuchadnezzar's own inscriptions speak of making a name, of building to heaven, of gathering peoples under his rule. Therefore, the Babel story becomes a kind of theological resistance literature. It says that what looks like triumph is actually folly. What appears permanent is temporary. What seems to reach heaven actually provokes heaven's response. The confusion of languages in Genesis mirrors the political fragmentation that eventually overtook every empire, including Babylon itself. The exiles had one more advantage. They outlasted their captors. Babylon fell to the Persian king Cyrus in 539 BCE. The Jewish people were given permission to return home and rebuild. Many did. Some stayed, forming communities that would persist for millennia. Yet whether in exile or restored, they carried these stories with them. They remembered that towers fall, empires crumble, but the covenant endures. When we read Genesis chapter 11 today, we're reading words shaped by people who stood in Babylon's shadow. They saw humanity's boldest building project up close. They felt its weight. They understood its seduction. They knew how easily one could worship the work of human hands. Their response was to tell a story that said simply, we've seen this before. We know how it ends. The Etemenanki no longer stands. Alexander the Great ordered its demolition centuries later, intending to rebuild it even grander. His death prevented that dream. The tower was never rebuilt. Today, only archaeological foundations remain, filled with groundwater, yet the story it helped shape continues to shape us. That's the real legacy. The Pentecost reversal, Babel's curse undone. Fast forward roughly 600 years from Babylon's fall. A small group gathers in an upper room in Jerusalem. They're followers of a teacher who was executed weeks earlier. They claim he rose from death. They say he gave them instructions before ascending to heaven. Now they wait, uncertain of what comes next. Then it happens. A sound fills the house, not quite wind, not quite voice, something between, something other. Tongues like fire appear above their heads. They begin speaking, but not in their native Aramaic. Languages pour out, languages they've never studied, never heard, languages from the edges of the known world: Parthian, Median, Elamite, Egyptian, Latin, Greek, Phrygian, Arabic. Outside, Jerusalem swells with pilgrims. It's Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks, 50 days after Passover. Jews from every corner of the Roman Empire and beyond have traveled here. The crowd represents a stunning diversity. Different homelands, different dialects, different cultural memories. They share faith in the God of Abraham, but they communicate in fragments through interpreters with difficulty. Then they hear the commotion. They gather outside the house. These Galileans are speaking, and somehow, impossibly, each person hears their own language. Not translation, not interpretation, direct understanding. A man from Libya hears flawless Libyan. A woman from Parthia hears perfect Parthian. The message is about God's mighty works, about promises fulfilled, about a new thing breaking into the world. Some in the crowd are amazed. Others mock, suggesting the speakers are drunk. Peter stands to address them. He explains that prophecy is being fulfilled. The prophet Joel spoke of God pouring out his Spirit on all people, sons and daughters, young and old, servants and free. This is that day. This is the beginning of something that will spread to every nation. The connection to Babel isn't made explicit in the text of Acts chapter 2, yet early Christian theologians immediately recognized the parallel. At Babel, humanity's unified language was confused because of proud rebellion. At Pentecost, the Spirit creates understanding across linguistic barriers because of humble faith. The curse appears reversed. Beyond just pattern recognition, deeper theological currents flow here. Babel scattered humanity outward in judgment. Pentecost sends humanity outward in mission. Babel created division through confusion. Pentecost creates unity through comprehension. Babel punished the attempt to reach God through human works. Pentecost celebrates God reaching down to humanity through divine grace. Consider what the miracle actually does. The apostles don't all start speaking one universal language. That would be a simple reversal, a return to the pre-Babel unity. Instead, they speak many languages. The diversity remains. What changes is the ability to understand across that diversity. The barriers don't disappear. They become bridges. This distinction matters immensely. If Pentecost simply erased linguistic difference, it would suggest that unity requires uniformity. Yet the text insists otherwise. People from 15 different regions all hear in their own tongues. Their particularity is honored. Their linguistic identity is affirmed. Unity comes not through sameness, but through the Spirit's power to create comprehension despite difference. The theological statement is bold. God doesn't want homogeneity. He wants harmony. He doesn't desire one voice. He desires a chorus. The scattering at Babel, seen through this lens, wasn't purely punitive. It served to create the very diversity that would one day glorify God more fully when brought into unity without uniformity. 3,000 people respond to Peter's message that day. They're baptized. A community forms. This community continues to grow, spreading from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. Everywhere it goes, it crosses linguistic and cultural boundaries. Paul writes to churches in multiple languages. Scriptures get translated. The message adapts to local contexts while maintaining its core. Early Christians saw this expansion as prophetic fulfillment. Babel scattered the nations. The gospel gathers them back, but not to one place or one language. Rather, it gathers them to one Lord, one faith, one hope. The scattering served divine purposes. It prepared the world for a message that would speak to every tribe and tongue. The symbolism deepens when we remember that Pentecost was already a harvest festival. It celebrated the first fruits of the wheat harvest. Now it became a celebration of the first fruits of a spiritual harvest. The 3,000 converts were just the beginning. Eventually, people from every language group would hear and believe. The fields scattered at Babel would yield a crop beyond imagining. Critics might argue that the Pentecost account is more complicated. They note that the confusion of language in Genesis seems permanent, while the understanding at Pentecost is momentary. They point out that Christian history is filled with linguistic and cultural division, suggesting the reversal is incomplete. These observations have merit. Yet, the theological claim isn't that Pentecost perfectly and permanently solved the problem Babel created. Rather, it's that Pentecost reveals the ultimate direction of redemption. It points toward a future where understanding transcends barriers. It offers a foretaste of the final gathering when people from every nation will stand before God's throne in worship. The book of Revelation describes this scene, a great multitude beyond counting from every nation, tribe, people, and language. They're not all speaking the same language. Their diversity persists, yet they're unified in worship, in purpose, in praise. Pentecost was the down payment on that future, the guarantee that what God scattered for judgment, he would regather in mercy. The linguistic legacy. Are we still living in Babel? The world speaks roughly 7,000 languages today, from Mandarin Chinese, spoken by over 1 billion people, to endangered tongues spoken by a handful of elders in remote villages. This staggering diversity raises an ancient question. Did it begin at Babel? Modern linguistics offers a different story. Languages don't emerge from sudden divine intervention. They evolve gradually, branching and changing over centuries and millennia through natural processes. Communities separate geographically. They develop distinct vocabularies for their environments. Sound shifts accumulate. Grammar transforms. Within a few generations, mutual understanding becomes difficult. Within centuries, impossible. Scholars have traced these changes backward through time. They've reconstructed proto-languages, theoretical ancestors of modern language families. The most famous is Proto-Indo-European, believed to have been spoken somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago. From this single tongue, dozens of modern languages descend: English, Spanish, Hindi, Russian, Greek, Persian, all cousins, separated by time and distance. Therefore, we face a puzzle. The Bible places Babel roughly 4,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries depending on how you calculate biblical chronology. Linguistic evidence suggests the major language families began diverging much earlier, perhaps twice as long ago. The timelines don't align neatly. More than just timing, the mechanisms differ. Genesis describes instantaneous confusion. One moment, everyone understands each other. The next, they cannot. Linguistic science describes gradual drift. Dialects emerge within a language. These dialects grow more distinct. Eventually, they become separate languages. The process takes generations, not moments. So do we dismiss the Babel account as myth? Do we insist on its literal truth and reject scientific findings? A third option exists. We can read the stories as encoding ancient observations about linguistic diversity in a theological framework. Think about what early humans would have noticed. People in the next valley speak differently. People across the mountains are incomprehensible. The further you travel, the less you understand. Someone in the ancient world observing this would naturally ask why. Why aren't we all the same? Why this confusion? The Babel story provides an answer rooted in theology rather than biology or history. It says that humanity's tendency toward pride and self-glorification results in fragmentation. It says that when we unite for the wrong purposes, God disrupts that unity. It says that our inability to understand each other has moral dimensions, not just linguistic ones. Modern science adds to this understanding without necessarily contradicting it. Linguists have identified language families spread across vast regions. The Indo-European family stretches from Iceland to India. The Sino-Tibetan family dominates East Asia. The Niger-Congo family covers much of Africa. Each family suggests ancient migrations, separations, and adaptations. Archaeological evidence supports this picture. Early human populations moved in waves across continents. Some groups settled, others continued onward. Isolation bred linguistic change. Trade and conquest brought languages into contact, creating new hybrids and loanwords. The map of human language reflects the map of human movement. One finding particularly fascinates. Many language families show evidence of vocabulary related to agriculture, domesticated animals, and specific technologies. Proto-Indo-European speakers apparently knew horses, wagons, and grain cultivation. This suggests the language spread with agricultural peoples who migrated from their homeland, probably the steppes north of the Black Sea. Such migrations would have occurred over centuries. Gradually, the original language fractured into daughter languages as communities lost regular contact. By the time written records begin, the family already consisted of multiple distinct languages. Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin were separate by the time we have texts in them, yet scholars can reconstruct their common ancestor through careful comparison. This process occurred independently in multiple regions. The Sino-Tibetan family diversified. The Austronesian family spread across the Pacific. The Bantu family expanded through Africa. Each case shows language change following population movement and separation. The pattern repeats because the causes repeat. Perhaps most striking is that linguistic diversity correlates with geographic isolation. Papua New Guinea, though relatively small in area, hosts over 800 languages. Its mountainous terrain created natural barriers between communities. With limited contact, languages diverged dramatically. Conversely, the rise of empires with common languages like Latin or Arabic often led to linguistic unity over vast areas, at least temporarily. The technology age has introduced new dynamics. English has become a global lingua franca, spoken as a second language by perhaps 2 billion people. The internet connects speakers across former barriers, yet simultaneously, smaller languages face extinction at unprecedented rates. Estimates suggest a language dies roughly every 2 weeks as the last native speakers pass away. Does this represent Babel continuing or Babel being undone? The answer depends on perspective. Global communication increases, allowing people who speak different native languages to understand each other through common second languages or translation tools. Yet the loss of linguistic diversity represents cultural and cognitive impoverishment. Each language encodes unique ways of understanding and categorizing the world. Some linguists argue that linguistic diversity is worth preserving for practical reasons. Different languages excel at different things. Some have incredibly precise vocabularies for describing spatial relationships. Others have grammatical structures that efficiently convey temporal information. Losing these languages means losing alternative ways of thinking. Beyond practicality, philosophical questions arise. Does the existence of thousands of languages represent a punishment, or does it represent a gift? Does linguistic diversity make us weaker through confusion, or stronger through multiple perspectives? The Genesis account treats the confusion of languages as judgment, certainly. Yet even judgment can serve redemptive purposes. The scattering prevented humanity from pursuing collective evil more effectively. It forced diversity, which created resilience. It meant that no single empire could unify humanity under tyranny because linguistic barriers limited the scope of control. Viewed this way, Babel's legacy isn't simply curse. It's also protection. It's the insurance that human ambition will always face limits. It's the guarantee that totalitarian dreams will fracture against the reality of human difference. Every empire that tried to impose one language, one culture, one way of being eventually failed. Linguistic diversity proved remarkably resistant to homogenization. So do we still live in Babel? Yes and no. We live with Babel's consequences. We speak different languages. We misunderstand each other regularly. Translation is imperfect. Communication across cultures remains challenging. In that sense, the confusion continues. Yet we also live after Pentecost. We have unprecedented tools for translation and communication. We've built bridges across linguistic divides. We've created systems, imperfect as they are, for people of different languages to work together, trade, create, and sometimes even love across barriers. The confusion remains, but so does the possibility of understanding. The modern towers, Babel as a cautionary tale for the 21st century. Silicon Valley has a tower problem, not physical ziggurats of brick and bitumen, digital ones, platforms that connect billions, algorithms that shape thought, systems that promise to bring humanity together under one seamless interface. Sound familiar? The tech giants speak a revealing language. They want to connect the world, to create a global community, to make information universally accessible, to build systems so comprehensive, so integrated that everyone uses them. Facebook's mission once stated they wanted to give everyone a voice and bring the world closer together. Google aimed to organize the world's information. Amazon sought to be Earth's most customer-centric company, implying global reach. These ambitions aren't evil. Many people benefit from connectivity. Families separated by distance can video call. Researchers can access libraries of information instantly. Movements for justice can organize across borders. The technology does good. Yet there's something unsettling in the totality of the vision. When one company mediates the majority of human social connection, what happens to diversity of thought? When one algorithm decides what information billions see, who guards against manipulation? When one platform becomes essential for participation in modern life, what power does that platform wield? This echoes Babel's central concern. Not that ambition is wrong, not that building is bad, rather that unified human effort directed towards self-glorification and unchecked by limits creates danger. The danger multiplies when that effort succeeds. Consider artificial intelligence. The promise is extraordinary. AI could solve problems that have plagued humanity for generations. Medical diagnosis, climate modeling, resource distribution, transportation optimization. The benefits seem limitless. Yet the builders of these systems speak with a certainty that should give us pause. They promise artificial general intelligence within years or decades. They envision machines surpassing human intelligence across all domains. Some even speak of achieving godlike capabilities. The language of transcendence permeates the field. Meanwhile, questions about control remain murky. Who decides what values are programmed into superintelligent AI? What happens when these systems operate beyond human comprehension? Who benefits from their deployment? What happens to the millions whose livelihoods become obsolete? The Babel story warns us about collective action that fails to reckon with its own limitations. The builders said they would reach heaven. They believed nothing would be impossible for them. God's response was to introduce limits, to fragment the unified effort. Not because building was wrong, but because building without humility, without recognition of creatureliness, without checks on power, leads to catastrophe. Some dismiss these concerns as Luddite fear. They argue that technology always faces resistance, that fears of automation have proven overblown in the past, that we'll adapt as we always have. This response misses the point. The question isn't whether technology brings change. It's whether that change serves genuine flourishing or just the interests of those building the towers. Consider the loss of cultural diversity through technological homogenization. Netflix and Spotify offer access to global entertainment, yet their algorithms push users toward mainstream content. Local music scenes struggle, regional cinema dies, indigenous art forms lose audiences. The promise was democratization. The reality often resembles colonization wearing a digital mask. Or examine how the internet, meant to be radically decentralized, has consolidated around a few massive platforms. Email was supposed to be open protocol. Now Gmail dominates. Web hosting was supposed to empower anyone. Now Amazon Web Services hosts a huge portion of the internet. The original vision of radical diversity has given way to centralized control. This pattern repeats across technologies. Television was going to educate and unite. Instead, it became a tool of manipulation and consumerism. Nuclear power would provide unlimited clean energy. Instead, we got weapons that could end civilization. Genetic engineering promises to eliminate disease. It might also enable designer humans and new forms of inequality. The problem isn't technology itself. The problem is assuming that technical solutions exist for problems that are fundamentally moral and spiritual. The problem is believing that human cleverness can transcend human nature. The problem is building towers without asking whether we should, what values they encode, and who they serve. Babel's builders wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to avoid being scattered. Both goals reveal the underlying anxiety. They feared their own insignificance. They sought to overcome their limitations through collective action. The tower was meant to secure their legacy, to prove their worth, to reach toward divinity. Modern towers get built from similar anxieties. Fear of death drives medical technology that extends life regardless of quality. Fear of being forgotten drives social media addiction. Fear of vulnerability drives surveillance systems. Fear of the other drives border walls and identification systems. We build to assuage our anxieties, rarely asking whether the building addresses root causes or just symptoms. The Genesis account suggests an alternative. Accept limitations, embrace scattering, recognize that unity without diversity becomes tyranny. Understand that reaching for heaven without invitation becomes hubris. The confusion of languages was judgment, yes, but also mercy. It prevented the completion of a project that would have led to greater harm. What would it mean to apply these lessons today? It might mean choosing not to build certain technologies even though we can. It might mean deliberately maintaining diversity of systems rather than pursuing efficiency through consolidation. It might mean accepting that some problems don't have technical solutions and require moral and spiritual transformation instead. It might mean asking different questions. Not, can we build this? But should we build this? Not, will this make us powerful? But will this make us good? Not, does this advance human capability? But does this advance human flourishing? The challenge is that markets don't ask these questions. Competition drives toward building whatever is possible. If one company refuses to develop risky technology, another will. If one country limits itself, another won't. The pressure toward unified ambition, toward building the tower as high as possible, proves nearly irresistible. This is precisely why the Babel story remains relevant. It names the impulse, it shows the pattern, it warns of the consequences. Whether we heed the warning is up to us. The tower builders in Genesis didn't. They kept building until God intervened. We might hope for wisdom to pause before intervention becomes necessary. Babel in Art and Imagination, from Bruegel to Borges. In 1563, a Flemish painter named Pieter Bruegel stood before a wood panel and began creating what would become the most famous artistic interpretation of the Tower of Babel ever made. His painting, now hanging in Vienna's Kunsthistorisches Museum, captures something that the Genesis text leaves to imagination: the scale, the complexity, the hubris made visible. Bruegel's tower spirals upward in ascending rings, modeled partly on the Roman Colosseum he'd seen during travels in Italy. Yet where the Colosseum stands in ruins, testament to empire's transience, Bruegel's tower is still under construction. Thousands of tiny figures swarm over its levels. Cranes lift materials, workers carry burdens, ships in the harbor below unload cargo. The whole scene buzzes with activity. Look closer and you notice something unsettling. The structure is doomed. The upper levels tilt at dangerous angles. Arches are built perpendicular to slanted ground rather than true horizontal. The foundation cannot support what rises above. The tower's flaw isn't that God will destroy it. The flaw is built into its very structure. It will collapse under its own weight. In the lower left corner, a figure presumed to be Nimrod, legendary instigator of the tower, consults with architects while workers bow before him. This detail matters. Bruegel painted this in 16th century Antwerp, one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, a hub of trade and ambition. The painting served as commentary on his own time as much as ancient Babylon. Antwerp was experiencing explosive growth. Merchants from across the world gathered there. Multiple languages filled the streets. Wealth flowed through its markets. Sound familiar? Bruegel seemed to be asking his contemporaries to consider whether their own city was building a tower destined for confusion. More than just social commentary, the religious dimension resonates. Bruegel worked during the Protestant Reformation. Europe was fragmenting along religious lines. The Catholic Church conducted services in Latin, a language most couldn't understand. Protestants pushed for vernacular translations and local languages. The confusion of tongues wasn't just ancient history. It was present reality. Bruegel painted at least 3 versions of Babel, though one is lost. The surviving Rotterdam painting shows the tower from a different angle, painted on a smaller scale but with equally intricate detail. Art historians count over 1,000 individual figures in these works, each one engaged in specific tasks. The obsessive detail serves the larger point. Look at what human industry can accomplish, then remember it won't be enough. His influence spread immediately. Other Flemish and Dutch painters took up the theme. Lucas van Valkenborg painted multiple Babel towers in the 1560s and beyond. The motif became almost required for artists demonstrating technical skill. You proved your ability by rendering the impossible architecture, the teeming crowds, the audacious scale. Yet the meaning shifted across different artists. Some emphasized divine judgment, others focused on human folly. Still others found in Babel a meditation on the nature of community, communication, and what holds societies together or tears them apart. The story proved endlessly flexible, always relevant to new contexts. Jump forward several centuries to Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine writer who made Babel central to his most famous short story. In the Library of Babel, he imagines an infinite library containing every possible combination of letters. Every book that has been written or could be written exists somewhere in its hexagonal galleries. The librarians search endlessly for meaning in the chaos of infinite text. Borges wasn't writing about a physical tower. He was writing about the tower of human knowledge, the ambition to catalog and comprehend everything. His library is both magnificent and maddening. It contains all truth and all lies. It holds the book that explains the library's nature, but finding it among infinity is impossible. The confusion at Babel becomes the confusion of information overload. His story captures something distinctly modern. We don't lack information. We're drowning in it. The internet is a kind of library of Babel, containing everything from profound wisdom to utter nonsense, with no reliable way to distinguish between them. The confusion of languages becomes the confusion of voices, all speaking at once, none achieving clarity. Film directors have repeatedly returned to Babel as well. Fritz Lang's 1927 silent film Metropolis features a city built on the labor of oppressed workers, with the wealthy living in towers above. The visual language deliberately evokes Babel. The tower becomes a metaphor for class division and the dehumanization of workers under capitalism. More recently, Alejandro González Iñárritu directed Babel in 2006, a film with interwoven stories across Morocco, Mexico, Japan, and the United States. The title refers less to a physical tower than to the barriers of language, culture, and understanding that separate people. Characters struggle to communicate across linguistic and cultural divides. Small misunderstandings cascade into tragedy. The confusion is omnipresent. Video games have explored the theme. The Tower of Babel appears in multiple fantasy settings as a dungeon to climb or a mystery to solve. The tower represents the ultimate challenge, the final level, the place where heroes prove themselves or fall. The symbolism shifts from theological to ludic, yet something of the original resonance remains. Comic books and graphic novels have tackled Babel too. Artists love the visual challenge of rendering an impossible structure. Writers appreciate the metaphorical richness. The tower becomes a way to explore themes of ambition, communication, divine power, and human limitation within fantastical contexts. Music hasn't ignored the story either. Composers from Renaissance polyphony to contemporary electronic music have created pieces titled Tower of Babel, or drawing on its themes. The confusion of languages translates to the confusion of genres, styles, and influences. Some pieces embrace cacophony as aesthetic choice. Others seek harmony amid diversity. Children's literature has dozens of retellings. Some focus on the narrative itself, teaching the biblical story to young readers. Others use Babel as a jumping-off point for stories about cooperation, communication, or the importance of understanding different perspectives. The tower becomes pedagogical tool. Architecture continues the fascination. Proposed buildings sometimes get dubbed modern Babel by critics worried about hubris. When plans for super-tall skyscrapers emerge, commentators invoke the old story. The Freedom Tower built at Ground Zero in New York, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, China's many mega projects. Each invites comparison to the ancient ziggurat and questions about whether we've learned anything. The persistence of Babel in art and imagination reveals something important. The story addresses perennial human concerns, ambition and its limits, communication and its failures, unity and diversity, power and its proper use. These themes don't age. Every generation finds new ways to tell itself the old warning. Perhaps most telling, artists rarely treat the Babel story as triumphant or celebratory. Even when admiring human achievement represented by the tower, the art acknowledges something doomed in the enterprise. The most detailed, loving renderings of Babel's architecture carry within them the knowledge that the tower cannot stand. Beauty and futility intertwine. This artistic tradition keeps the story alive in ways that purely theological discourse might not. When Bruegel's painting tours museums, crowds gather. When Borges' story appears in anthologies, students discuss it. When films invoke Babel, audiences recognize the reference. The story has escaped its scriptural origins to become part of shared cultural vocabulary. That vocabulary lets us talk about things that might otherwise be difficult to articulate. When we see corporate headquarters reaching for the sky and call them Babel, we're making a claim about pride and risk. When we describe the internet as a Tower of Babel, we're noting information chaos and communication breakdown. When we invoke Babel in climate discussions, we're warning about collective action problems and the need for coordinated response despite linguistic and cultural barriers. The artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians who return to this story again and again do so because it continues to speak. It names something we recognize. It shows us ourselves in ancient clothes. It whispers that we're not the first to reach so high, nor will we be the last. And it asks, gently or urgently depending on the artist, whether we might pause long enough to learn from those who built before us. The Scattered Hope, Finding Unity Without Uniformity. We've walked Babel's story from ancient bricks to modern servers, from the Genesis narrative to the Pentecost reversal, from Mesopotamian ziggurats to digital networks. So what does it all mean? Traditionally, Babel is read as pure tragedy, humanity unified, punished for pride, scattered in judgment. But that reading ignores the earlier command in Genesis 9, fill the earth. The builders refused. They wanted consolidation, not dispersion, control, not obedience. The scattering wasn't sabotaging unity, it was enforcing God's original design for humanity to spread, diversify, and explore. This reframes the event. The judgment at Babel was also a protection. A single unified humanity, driven by a single will, could commit evil with terrifying efficiency. Linguistic diversity acted as a circuit breaker. It fractured the concentration of power. It prevented global tyranny before global tyranny existed. Imagine history without that barrier. Every empire expanding unchecked, every dictator unhindered by language or culture, every ideology spreading instantly to every corner of the world. Cultural alternatives would vanish. Resistance would be rare. Totalitarianism would be trivial. Instead, because of diversity, no empire has ever held the planet. When one collapses, others remain. When one culture goes blind, others preserve insight. Humanity becomes resilient, not despite its differences, but because of them. As a metaphor, Babel becomes less a curse and more an immune system, one that slows the spread of human evil by preserving difference. Pentecost sharpens this point. The Spirit doesn't erase diversity. The apostles don't speak one language, they speak many, and everyone hears in their own tongue. The miracle is not uniformity, but understanding across difference. Babel scattered, Pentecost connected, but neither demanded sameness. This matters now more than ever. Technology tempts us to treat diversity as inefficiency, to flatten languages, merge cultures, standardize everything, and build platforms that make everyone think the same way. But that trajectory risks rebuilding the very thing God dismantled. Unity that demands sameness is not unity. It's domination dressed as progress. A better vision emerges from the Bible's arc, a world where people remain culturally distinct yet deeply connected, where communication bridges difference without dissolving it, where cooperation doesn't require assimilation. What would that look like? Global systems that translate rather than erase, technologies that empower local communities instead of absorbing them, international cooperation that protects cultural particularity, unity defined not by identical voices but by mutual understanding. Babel warns us about unity used for self-exaltation. Pentecost shows us unity that honors difference. Between the two shines a path humanity still needs to learn, a civilization that stays many yet understands one another, diverse yet connected, scattered yet hopeful. That is the unity Scripture imagines, not uniformity, but harmony across difference. Not one language for all people, but all nations understood by the same Spirit. Not a single tower reaching heaven, but a global humanity grounded in humility, dispersion, and shared purpose. The story doesn't end with Babel's confusion. It ends with a choice. Will we repeat the mistake or learn the lesson?